There we go. What I want to do in this webinar is I'm going to give you an overview of the creation and current use of motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing has been around about 30 years, but has gotten increasing popularity. I want to talk about the spirit of motivational interviewing and really what sets it apart from other approaches. I want to do a description of some of the approaches and techniques that are used in motivational interviewing, which I think can be applicable to social services work in the Salvation Army, and especially want to give us an opportunity to talk about the issues and ways in which this could be applied in our work. What it's not is an attempt to tell you everything about motivational interviewing in a few minutes. There's a quote from Frank Miller, the person who really came up with and designed that, who said people will say, "So can you tell me about motivational interviewing over a pizza at lunch?" And the answer is no. It's complicated. I'm going to put a slide up on the screen right now, and then that's really the last time you're going to see it, because what I'm not going to try to do is to go through the whole process of motivational interviewing. If I did that, it would be like one of the, like Lake Koshkonong, which is a lake around where I live, which is very wide and very, very shallow. So instead, what I want to do is to give you an idea of what it is, and then talk about some things that I think set it apart, and then some things that could be applicable. So let me start with the development of motivational interviewing. And it came, I think I may have given his name wrong, with William Miller, who shortly after his graduate training was hired in a program in which he was working with alcoholics, with people with addiction issues. And he said, I had no training in this area, never worked with this group before. He had come out of a psychology program that with a strong emphasis on the work of Carl Rogers, the person who came up with client-centered and then person-centered therapy. And the quote from Rogers there, man's inability to communicate is a result of his failure to listen effectively. And Rogers' approach really was designed around listening and listening to what people consider to be important, and then really let them direct the conversation from there. Excuse me, I've got, it's heavy allergy seasons, and I hope that's the last time. So Miller was working with alcoholics, and he said people had described them as manipulative and lying and deceitful, and his experience with them was that it just wasn't that way. And I think some of it was that he was not labeling, and that he really was listening intently to what they did. What he came away from that, and in his subsequent work, really pulled his idea of doing the Rogers' approach, but in a way that is more directive, as I'll point out, and in my opinion goes far beyond that, into the approach that we talk about in motivational interviewing. When he was in Europe, ran into a co-author, and they've been working together for essentially 30 years. One of the things that's most interesting about motivational interviewing and the way that this has evolved over time is that it's not just one person or two people. There's a very active group, the Motivational Interviewing network of trainers. And these are people who use motivational interviewing and who do training of motivational interviewing, and who also are very much participating in how this evolves. The third edition of the book on motivational interviewing, which came out last year, and in the book it says that 90% of the writing was new. Not 90% of the material is new, but essentially that he, and with the help of others, has been continually evolving that. And it's been used in lots of ways. It's used in addictions work, child protective services. A number of in Wisconsin, of the number of county departments of human services have been trained and then trained again recently in how to apply motivational interviewing to their work. So the reduction of HIV/AIDS transmission, and that's not only in this country, but that's also been used in Africa. Work with adolescents in school settings, in domestic violence programs, in juvenile and adult probation programs, probation and parole. I teach at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and was at a wheelchair basketball game. Whitewater has a world championship wheelchair basketball program, and one of our former students who graduated 20 years ago, I'm now doing adult probation work in Milwaukee, and one of the first things he asked was, to what degree are you incorporating motivational interviewing into your program? And we're starting to do that here, but it's been used a lot. So when we think about definitions, and again, you're going to have all of these, the PowerPoint will be sent to you. You can take some notes. I especially think it makes sense to take notes of any things that you want to ask me later in the program, but the definitions in the material will all be out to you within a relatively short period of time. So the definition that Miller and Skolnick use in their most recent book is it's a collaborative conversation style for strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment to change. Collaborative conversation style for strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment to change. And we'll as you'll see as I go through that, that comes through. I really also like this, and this is from the Motivational Interviewing Network training. It's a particular kind of conversation about change. And if you think about motivational interviewing as conversation, I think it helps to get a sense of what it is. And what Miller says is that to adopt it, to really practice it completely, it takes time, because it's a matter of not only changing what you do, but how you think about what you do. Now, one more thing related to definition, it's not specifically the same thing as the stages of change model that some of you who work in Pathway to Hope program are familiar with, or others with. They both came out at about the same time. And both Miller and James Prochaska, who developed this, have done some writing together, but they're not the same thing. Really, the one thing that they have in common is that they both really focus on change and on the individual's recognition of change before moving forward. So going back to William Miller, and what he says is that it's not a technique. It's a style of working for and with people. So in order to try to make that clear, what I want to do is to do this little exercise with you, kind of a thought experiment. So for a minute, choose something you are thinking about changing, some behavior, some action, some habit, something you want to change but have not done so yet. And let me just give people 20 seconds or so to come up with something that would fit your own life. So then imagine a helper, a friend, formal helper, and you're talking to this person about that issue, and what the person does then is tells you all the reasons you need to change, and then gives you a long list of reasons for changing, and emphasizes the importance of changing, and finally just tells you to get on with it. Just do it. Just do it. And so the question then is, how would you feel after it? And research that's been done on this says that about 5% of the people really appreciate it and say, yeah, that's what I need. I really just needed that kick somewhere in order to get myself going. And most people, on the other hand, feel uncomfortable, feel defensive. They may feel worse about themselves than they did before. It's, in general, that approach of exhorting people to change doesn't work. So going back to that example of the action or behavior or habit that you would like to change, assume that the helper asked you these questions. Why do you want to make this change? And how might you go about it in order to succeed? And what are the 3 best reasons for you to do that? And how important is it for you to make this change, and why? And then after that conversation, in which the person asks the questions and listens to you respond to those, gives a short summary of what the helper has heard, and then asks the question, so what do you think you will do? And if that were the process that you went through, how would you feel? And many people would feel like that was a process that gave them perhaps some more information for themselves, that they had really talked about the reasons to do it. They might feel more likely to go ahead and consider. And so the difference in conversations is a lot of what motivational interviewing is. Miller says in order to understand motivational interviewing, you really need to start with the spirit rather than the techniques. And the spirit of motivational interviewing are these 4. Compassion that is first is the one that was added in the most recent version of the book. So let me just run through these briefly. That compassion, and this quote from the Dalai Lama, I think, illustrates that: the wish to seeing others free from suffering. It's not sympathy, but it's that real desire that comes across for people for their lives to be better. Acceptance, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you approve of the person's actions or choices, but it involves prizing the inherent worth of everyone, honoring each person's autonomy, their self-determination, and sometimes that's difficult to do. And what people in motivational interviewing will say is that it's difficult to do, but when you don't do it, then often what that does is that just raises people's defensiveness. It involves affirming each person's strengths and efforts. And the final one, and this is really where it moves more from philosophy to actually skills, is it utilizes accurate empathy, an active interest in and effort to see the world through the eyes of another, to understand the perspective that the other person has. And so part of acceptance is really that acceptance of someone really comes through that effort to understand that person. And what they would say, and what I would agree, is that that does 2 things. Is that one, that it helps you get, probably 3 things. It helps you get some information that otherwise you would not have. It helps the person to explore things that the person may not have explored. But it also communicates, almost like a meta-communication way, that you're interested, that you really see that person as someone unique, not as a member of a group, not through a label, and that all fits in with the issue of acceptance. The third kind of principle of the spirit is collaboration, the idea that we're working with a person. The analogy is that and this is from the pictures from Mount Everest, is that the worker takes the role of a guide. One of the things that we know with helping is that there's an incredible power differential between workers and clients, and the worker is often seen as an expert. The more degrees you have, the more you're seen as an expert. And the idea of trying to walk alongside the person in the role of a guide. And then evocation, which is the fourth, and the idea that people are most likely to be persuaded by what they hear themselves say. So if in the language that we'll talk about in a minute, if people are talking about the need to change, the intent to change, things that they have done that leads to change in their life, that's much, much more powerful than anything that the worker can say. So that's the spirit, and that really also moves us and is really the transition between what's important and how do you get there. And so what the worker is doing is listening to the person, and he's listening for change talk. And change talk is the broad category that they use in motivational interviewing for several kinds of things. It includes the disadvantages of maintaining the behavior. What are all the ways in which this behavior or action gets in the way? And that could be the issue of just the high stress of struggling to pay the rent each time. It could be issues around the way people parent their children. It could be issues around substance abuse, etc. They're listening for when people talk about the advantages of change, about, yeah, it would be nice if. Listening for people talking about optimism about change, how likely it is that it could happen, and the intention to change. And so those are the things that you've got an ear out for, that you're tuning your ear to listen to. And then there are some approaches for listening change talk and for that appearing. And one of those is just asking for more details. And you may especially be asking for more details when people talk about something that has been done that's positive. So that gives you some idea, because often people just generalize and they run things together, and so and they're not aware of what they have done that really is positive. You can ask about extreme situations. What's the worst that could happen? Because I think that often will help set parameters for people to think about things. And in terms of what's the worst that could happen if they made that change, you may find out that it's not that terrible. What's the worst that could happen if they don't change? And that may be something that they haven't thought about. You can explore the past and the future. One thing, and this is not just related to motivational interviewing, I think it's just related to just good practice. We often see people when they're in crisis, when things are bad, when things maybe have been bad for a while, and we don't get that picture of what life was like for that person when things were working better. And although it sounds weird to say, that person may not really remember that well either, because all of us tend to live in the present. So going back and finding that may uncover some strengths. And the idea of thinking about the future may give some idea of how the person wants things to be different and better, and that can lead to motivation for change. So some examples about, before you lost your job, what was your life like? If you continue as you are now, what do you think will happen? Tell me what life will be like for you in 5 years. And then when you're asking about that also can be related to the goals and values, to things that people have said have said are important. I said earlier that this had come from the work of Carl. In some ways, it came from the work of Carl Rogers. The difference is that Rogers tended to be very non-directive. And what happens with motivational interviewing, because the focus is on change and on understanding how the person thinks about change and the possibility of change and reasons not to change and reasons to change, etc., is that that in the questions and in the reflections, trying to focus and get there. One of the ways of doing that is to try to evoke discrepancies, because change is motivated by perceived differences between present behavior and personal values or goals. This is what I see as important for myself and my family, for myself and my children. And here's what I'm doing now. And there's a gap between those. And being able to voice the gap for the worker, for the client to be able to do that can lead to a sense of this is something that bothers me and may bother me enough to do something about it. So the person you're talking to discovers and presents their own arguments for change. And I think that this quote from Romans really is applicable to that idea. Now that's a little bit about motivational interviewing and the spirit of motivational interviewing and a little bit of the approach. And I said because of time, I don't want to go through all of the parts and pieces of it. I do want to tell you about what I find the things that are most powerful. What Miller says is that therapists and workers often will hear about it, read about it, go to a workshop and say about this or that and the other. Oh, that makes sense. It's really apparent. And I think for everybody, that's likely to be different. So I want to share what the things were for me that when I came across them that I really thought were powerful. And one of those is the reframing that's done. Now, reframing, as you know, is that idea of looking at a situation, a behavior, an action, the way we think about things from a different perspective. It really comes out of photography, in which photographers talk about changing the frame. If you've got a camera where you can adjust and you're adjusting it from looking from things that are close to things that are far off, that's changed the frame. You shift in terms of what's in and out of your viewfinder, and you've changed the frame. So one of the things that, and often we do this in working with people, and so one of the reframing starts with resistance, because social workers, as long as I've been in the field and I've been in for a while, talk about resistant clients. Resistant clients that kind of dig in their heels and don't want to do anything. And so the idea of reframing resistance to the term sustained talk. In motivational interviewing, they talk about change talk, and I gave you the ideas, I gave you some examples of change talk. Sustained talk really is that idea of wanting to hold on to what the person is doing, because a desire to hold on to the status quo is normal. There are, none of us really likes to change. That's difficult. That ambivalence is a common reaction to the thought of change in which something would have to be given up, and something would almost always has to be given up. That there's almost always are payoffs to any behavior. Working with families that were homeless, and they talked about becoming homeless because they really wanted to do something special for their kids, or there was something really special that they wanted to do, and then there was less work that week, and they couldn't make the rent, and one thing led to another. with any kind of addiction, with most kinds of, quote, irresponsible behaviors, there's a payoff. There's a payoff. Uh, and that's understandable. So when I think about what people say as they're trying to hold on to what's familiar rather than they're resistant, I think about both the behaviors and the people differently. So what Miller would say is that when people are talking about change talk, it's like a green light. You keep going. When they're talking about sustained talk, then you don't want to be the person arguing for change, right? You want to stop and go back and figure out what it is that you can do that moves the conversation away from, here are all the reasons why I can't do this. And when I talk about things that I found were powerful, I'm going to go back to this slide that I used earlier about people are most likely to be persuaded by what they hear themselves say. And when workers can get in a conversation with clients in which they are feeling comfortable enough to talk about what's important to them, then some of those things can come out. Another thing, and so this is a question, or sort of a question, although I'm going to answer it myself, is that what do motivational interviewing and improv have in common? Now, I don't know if you've been to comedy clubs, places where improv theater, where you get a group of people up on stage and they may get suggestions on what kind of a scene they're in and what they're doing. And so what does that have to do with motivational interviewing? Well, what they both have in common is the word yes and. Because in doing improv, people build on the scene. Someone says we're flying a spaceship and the next person would say yes, and it looks like we're headed toward a black hole. And so the audience knows that that's what the situation is. When we say yes, but, people are likely to get defensive. And so one of the really kind of skilled behavior is how do you both agree with people and also maybe add a twist to it so that it is, so that one is not completely agreeing, but they're less likely to get defensive. Now, in motivational interviewing, there are core skills, and I wanted to share the skills partly because there are some pieces in that I think that even if one does not use much of what's in motivational interviewing, really just kind of add to the skill set that people have. So I'll start with the one that's probably most familiar to you. So we have open questions and affirmations and reflections and summaries. So open questions, as you know, are ones that require more than a yes or no short answer. They shouldn't be too broad. If you ask somebody how are things going, that it's too big. Really needs to be within a ballpark so that people will give more than a word or two, but it's not too big, too overwhelming. And then there are open questions that are not in the form of a question, such as tell me more about this. And open questions are really valuable in that they serve to help you understand a person's life from that person's own perspective. Affirmations are compliments. It's praising positive behaviors. It's supporting the person as they describe difficult situations. And one of the reasons for asking open questions and asking for detail, can you tell me more about that? Now, when that happened, how did you manage to get through it? And when we ask those kinds of questions, then there's likely to get the kind of detail to where you can make those kinds of affirmations. One thing that I found, and I used to work with men who'd been arrested for domestic violence. And in the group settings, when I would do some affirmations, when I would be giving some praise, a lot of them would just get startled. And my co-facilitator, a social worker who'd been doing that work for a while. She said, most of these guys have not gotten pluses and praises in their life. These were mostly working class guys, high school grads, worked in factories, drank too much on a Friday night, came home, argument with a wife or girlfriend that led to the police getting called, and then they're having to do this group. And she said they didn't get that when they were growing up. They often don't get it in relationships. They don't get it in their work. But it's important. People need to hear affirmations. We need to do reflections, which are a paraphrase of what the person has said. And those are in the term of statements, not questions. And sometimes it's just reflection of facts or content. Sometimes it's reflections of emotions, or sometimes combined reflections. Like, yeah, you're feeling upset because of the way you were treated in work yesterday. Now, and those are more or less simple reflections. Motivational interviewing adds a couple of things, and these were things that I hadn't come across before. One of those is amplified reflections. So you're strengthening, or really almost maybe even exaggerating what the person said as you reflect it. And one, like any reflection, you can make sure that you really understood this. So the person said, if my kid does that one more time, I'm just walking out the house. You say, wow. So the next time Johnny does this, you're just packing your bags and leaving? And I made that too much of a question. But if the statement was extreme, you can see if they really meant it. So, well, I probably won't walk out then, but I could. But if it was too strong or wasn't correct, then the person will tell you. So like any reflection, you can get a sense of if you're accurate or not, but this really does in some cases say, well, kind of set the person back and say, no, it's really not that bad. Another one is a double-sided reflection. And double-sided reflection gives both sides of an argument. You can use and or but depending on how you want to proceed in the conversation. But the reason that this is really powerful is it really gets at that issue of ambivalence and the idea that ambivalence is normal. So you really feel like you need to stay in this job because your steady employment, and at the same time you don't like it and you're not making enough money. So you can use either and or but I think that it not only serves the function of reflection in terms of paraphrasing or reflecting in the sense of reflecting in a mirror what the person has said, but it also just captures that sense of ambivalence that people often have. I think that what's also done in the last of those is summarizing. It makes a summary statement that encompasses everything that was said. That's helpful to you to make sure you got it. It's a reflection over a period of minutes or period the person has said. And it also can be helpful if you want to move in a new direction, to be able to say, well, wow, heard you say this and this and this, all about how things are just not the way you'd want them to. And then one can then ask the question in terms of how would you like things to be different and better, or moving in one direction. We're listening to clients. We're listening to people we're talking to as in their conversation, but it is directive because you choose what you want to reflect from a discussion. Part of what makes this difficult, I think, and it's the same thing that makes, in some ways, working with people difficult, is that one really needs to listen intently. So you're trying to choose what to reflect from a discussion. It helps you move the conversation toward talking about change, and the person may be just complaining a lot about things, and there may be something in the middle of that complaint that really is kind of a glimmer of the person wants to do something besides complain, or about a possibility. And so one reflects on that. One picks that up as a question. So you listen carefully. The question is, what's the worker curious about? Again, not just what's interesting about the person, but what's important in terms of that movement. And then are you hearing in there a desire to change or an idea about how to change? And then in those cases, then that's what one follows up on. And the last of those pieces that really goes, it's not one of the ORs, the OARS, but I really wanted to make sure that I put this in the presentation, was the issue of supporting self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief that people can do something. What we've realized in the whole social sciences is that the concept of self-esteem doesn't work really well. I mean, people can have a very high opinion of themselves in one way, and we all know people where their view of themselves, their idea of themselves, is not really shared by anybody else. But self-efficacy really has to do with people's belief that they can be competent in an area, that they can change, and they can do that. And we all have higher degrees of self-efficacy in some areas than others. I'm better at doing webinars like this than I am at repairing cars, especially since they got more and more computerized. But that varies from place to place. But the issue of self-efficacy can be cultivated. People can draw on their hope and faith as personal resources to change, and your belief in their ability to change. And that's really that's that issue of compassion, that people want others not to be suffering, for life to be better, but also that sense that they can do that. They can do that. They can do it with help. They can do it, but that they can do it, and that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. So having said that, it's time for me to stop talking, because as I said at the start, I want to give time for you to talk with me and perhaps with each other. And really the questions I've got are, what have you seen and heard that could be applicable to your work? And then what questions do you have? So okay. I've got my webcam up. I can see myself. Unfortunately, can't see you. But what I'd like to hear, and these may be questions that have been typed in, what are the questions that people have, and what's the applicability that they see to their work?
Now you can use the control panel at this time to raise your hand, and I can unmute you. For those of you that have a gray phone icon, you simply need to put your PIN number in order for me to be able to unmute you. But if you do have any questions at this time, you can either click the raise my hand function, or you can type them into the question box in the chat area. Looks pretty quiet today, Dr. Winship.
Well, let's give people another minute or two to think about what could be applicable. Or I went through things pretty fast. I actually threw a lot of slides away because I didn't want to go, I didn't want to go any faster than I had been going. But it may be a lot of material, and I'm really interested in how people think that this could be applicable to their work.
Okay, someone has typed a comment into the question area. Jim, if you'd like to review that.
Just a second, let me pull that up. I'm not seeing that in mine. Go ahead and just read that to me.
Okay. What it says is, I like your suggestion to ask, where do you see yourself, or how would you like to handle this? Helps to access just how motivated the client, helps to assess just how motivated the client is, and a jumping point for direction and assistance.
I think so, and I think one of the and so the questions in many cases are not, you know, what the questions are done is just to try to elicit or try for those kinds of things to come out as the person talks, and if it's done in very much a conversational way, not as much related to just the issue of this is information that we have to have. One of the difficulties, and it's not something that I mentioned but is true, is one of the difficulties is that often we start off the initial meeting with somebody with lots of information that we need to get. That's important to have, and a lot of that is things that come from closed questions, so people are used to answering in a very few words, and then it's difficult to move to a conversation mode. But when we do that, then things like this do emerge.
We have another one. I'll read it to you. It says, how can you use motivational interviewing with one who has thought disorder or who is delusional?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. At the point, you know, and often with people who are delusional, it comes and goes. But the other piece is that the issue of values and goals and where people want to move in the future is, you know, still stays the same. Still stays the same. And I do think that, and especially if there is some kind of relationship, that being able to explore the discrepancies between what the person is doing and what the person sees as important can be useful.
And we have another. This is a comment. Sometimes it is difficult for me to listen well and with empathy while also being directive with motivational interviewing. Many times I find myself trying to find the right thing to say. Do you have any suggestions on how I can make it more natural and free-flowing?
You know, I think what everybody says is that it takes practice, and I think it's not that practice makes perfect, but it's really practice plus reflection plus practice makes perfect. And I think if you have a chance to do it with somebody else or just doing it with a journal in terms of kind of going through points where you thought it worked and then going back to what did I do then, and the points when it didn't work and kind of going back and saying, okay, what could I do next time? And then trying to just keep that as a process over time. And I think that that's the way in which one gets better, because it's not natural, because it's not the way we're used to talking to people.
And this is another good one, I think. It says, how do you help a client who is in very deep denial about their situation? Say someone with 6 DUIs but doesn't see a problem with alcohol.
You know, I think that this is really where Prochaska's work on stages of change really becomes apparent. And I think, you know, there's an overlap there. You know, what he would say is the person's in the pre-contemplation stage. And really, I think all that we can do is do the kinds of things that you know, that get to, you know, okay, you know, I understand that you don't see this as a problem. And are there, and this is the double-sided, And are there any ways in which it negatively affects your life? So in a way, you're not attacking the person, but you're just also asking that question. You're curious. I know that for some people, when they drink a lot, it has an impact on their life. And in your situation, are there any places where that happens? And the idea of trying to elicit situations. People with that many DUIs tend to be really defensive because people have been yelling about them for years. And so I think that there's a piece of it, and again, it's a fine line between not wanting to approve of the drinking behavior, but not wanting to be just slamming and coming down hard on the person. Brian, are we out of questions?
We have no more at this time.
Okay. Well then.
Oh, I do have a hand raised though.
Tracy, good.
I'm going to try unmuting you. I see you're on the microphone. Go ahead and try to speak, Tracy. And Tracy, if you can't talk, please type in the question chat box. But you are unmuted. And seeing no response as yet. Here it is. If during the interview a person is showing body language that is uncomfortable, should the interview continue?
Can you type more what uncomfortable means?
When you say uncomfortable body language, Tracy, what kind of thing are you meaning there? Asking about their immediate future and what plans they have, and they are not seemingly wanting to answer, but very hesitant.
Oh, okay. It may depend on relationship, but if there is some kind of relationship, I would just reflect back to the body language with reflection that is something like, wow, I can tell this is really difficult for you to talk about this right now, right? And then seeing how they respond to that. If they've shut down, they've shut down. But I think it acknowledges the uncomfortableness of it and trying to do that in a way that's not blaming.
And she says, thank you.
Okay.
I have to say personally, a lot of this makes me wish I worked out there in the field doing this sort of thing.
Yeah.
I have come close to a bit of it on my own time. I've gone out and sat in the grass with a few homeless people and had discussions, and I identify a lot with what I'm hearing.
Good. Brian, if that's all there is, my hunch is some people are probably already leaving, and so I'd like to say goodbye before everyone does. And again, I think if you have questions you wanted to get to me, Rachel has my email address. She's got my contact information, so I'd be glad to talk with anybody individually about any of this.
Okay, well, still not seeing anything, so whenever you're ready, we'll wrap up.
Okay, so you can go ahead and do the wrap-up if you wish.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I don't think there are any polls at the end of it. Thank you, Dr. Winship, for your wonderful presentation today. I'm getting more thank yous in the question area, and they're saying it was excellent as always, and we hope to see you again soon.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, everybody.